make time with her. Is everybody in this town on drugs?
About 5 years ago with Tim Leary, one raucous evening. Maybe some of you managed to catch that event. This is a little more thoughtful and reflective. I'm not here to talk or to speak or to promote my books as I have been in the past. This is the only public event that I'm doing in these 10 days, and I'm very grateful to David and Petra for inviting me. This is a wonderful facility, and bringing you plants and books and information. It's great to see that freak community is alive and well in Mannheim. What I'm in Europe to do is to be part of a film-making effort. And I want to describe the project to you a little bit, simply because it's what's on my mind, naturally, and to discuss the politics behind the making of this kind of a film. It's not a film about rave culture. It's not a film about Albert Hoffman. It's not a film about body piercing or any of these things that great films need to be done about and have been done about. It's about one of your local heroes who is a great hero of mine and should be a great hero to all freaks in Germany and everywhere. And I'm talking about Frederick V, Elector Palatine, Prince of Heidelberg, King of Bohemia. Are you all familiar with this guy? Who? No? Oh, well, this is your guy. This is the prototypic freak of this area, and a freak who was not content to sit back and let things happen, but was willing to launch a grand alchemical dream of a reformation of human society. So just to lay in the background for those of you who are not familiar, the historical incident that we're here to recreate here and later in Prague has to do with the Prince Palatine of Heidelberg, a Protestant who wedded the granddaughter of Queen Elizabeth I of England, Elizabeth Stuart, the daughter of James I of England. This was an arranged wedding. They were both 16 years old at the time. Frederick went to England. The wedding was held in England, and then he returned with his very English bride to Heidelberg. And they were the center of a movement of alchemical reformation and revolution that sought to take the Protestant Reformation an enormous leap forward into a new world of spiritual freedom and, to my mind, a very sort of psychedelic world. They were the heirs, the inheritors of the entire medieval worldview. It was folded in to this pair of 16-year-olds who were ruling the Palatinate of Heidelberg. And Frederick was an elector, meaning he was one of the 7 princes who could choose the emperor of what remained of the Holy Roman Empire at that time. And he conspired to become the King of Bohemia. The visionaries moved the entire court from Heidelberg, from the small-time scene of a principality, to Prague, to reoccupy the office of the Holy Roman Empire with an emperor friendly to magic and alchemy, who was the inheritor of a generation-old plan to create an alchemical reformation that had been hatched in the mind of the English alchemist and mathematician John Dee. And the ending of the story is not a happy ending, or perhaps it is. I mean, we can talk about that. On a superficial level, this alchemical dream, this Rosicrucian enlightenment, ended badly because the Habsburgs back in Madrid quickly got wind of what was going on and got an army together and sent it to Prague and laid siege to Prague, and Elizabeth fled to the Netherlands with her children. Frederick was defeated at the Battle of the White Mountain, and the alchemical dream died. And this was really, in some sense, the beginning of the 30 Years' War. And as you know, going into the 30 Years' War, Europe was a place of popes and kings. At the end of the 30 Years' War, it was a place ruled by parliaments and peoples, and the entire medieval world was swept away, and out of the new political dispensation of the situation at the end of the 30 Years' War, especially in England, modern science took hold and was born. And these angel-dealing, horoscope-casting, alchemy-pursuing visionaries of this Rosicrucian Renaissance became simply objects of historical curiosity, completely incomprehensible to the people who followed them generation after generation after generation, until, I submit to you, the present. And in the present moment, we, like they, inherit a world whose ideologies are exhausted and can only be refreshed from the margins. And that was what this whole alchemical revolt was about. It was about a suppressed, marginal minority of deeply pietistic, original thinkers, but heterodox, non-Christian, keeping together a tradition that I think has been reborn or rediscovered in our own time. And it's the tradition that nature is a great distillery of complexity, alchemical gold, novelty, connection, whatever you want to call it, in our own time through integrative sciences like ecology and animal behavior and psychology. We have re-understood what was forgotten during the reductionist centuries of modern science. We've re-understood that the world is one thing, and it's a living thing. It's a thing with an intent and a spirit within it. And this is the key concept. The concept that the alchemists and the hermetic dreamers and the occultists of the alchemical and Northern European Renaissance, they were trying to strengthen and condense and distill and make actual this sense of community, this spiritus. Well, then with the rise of modern science, all of that is anathema. And rational analysis tells us that matter is simply atoms flinging themselves through space, obedient to certain mathematical laws that are invariant. And all the creativity, all the sense of connectedness that we experience as living beings, as members of a society, as human beings in contemplation of nature, all of that was denied. And it reaches its ultimate culmination, just as an example, in the kind of statement such as was made by Jean-Paul Sartre, the French existentialist, who said, "Nature is mute." You understand what I mean? Nature gives no clue, he tells you. Man is alone in the cosmos with his complexes and his obsessions. He confers meaning. There is no a priori reality to which ethics or intent can be attached. I reject this. I think the entire message of the psychedelic experience, which is basically the sine qua non of the rebirth of alchemical understanding, the very basis of that understanding is that nature seeks to communicate. All being is pregnant with language. All reality wants to include the human side of nature in its ongoing intent. The problem lies not with nature, but with ourselves, that we are somehow paralyzed, disempowered, doubting, cut from the meat of the thing. Well, so I'm a great believer in propaganda, obviously. I mean, my whole life is about propaganda. So to take an incident like the career of Frederick the Elector Palatine of Heidelberg and his bride and make of it a kind of exemplar, a parable, a myth, if you will, the myth of the alchemical marriage, a myth that takes innocence and naivete and belief in the power of ideas to make a new world and tell that story again in film, backing it with these tremendously powerful alchemical images that Jung and others showed work inexorably on the psyche, whether you wish to be part of the process or not. To merely gaze upon the images of alchemy is to, in a sense, enter into a kind of psychoanalytical process, because what alchemy was, and I should stress this or the rap makes no sense at all, alchemy was not the vulgar pursuit of the transmutation of lesser metals into gold or silver. That was the charlatan's game, played in every market in Europe for centuries among the simple people. But the body of symbols and of literature that accreted around the effort to extract a universal medicine out of nature for the transformation of societies and human beings was in those times of what we call epistemological naivete, meaning that they did not have the strong sense of objective and subjective reality which we inherit from science. So during those eras of epistemological naivete, what was someone's idea about how matter behaves, what was someone's myth of how psyche behaves, could become entangled in a projective experience with material in a chemical vessel. So the processes which we call melting and crystallization and purification and calcinization, processes now well understood through a soulless molecular model of matter, were for them the birth of the red lion, the coming of the double-headed queen, the murder of the hermaphrodite dog, and so forth and so on. They had these outlandish images and outlandish vocabulary because they were trying to create powerful symbols, powerful mnemonic hooks on which to hold the details and there are many of them, of this extremely complex worldview that, were it not for people like Carl Jung, the Swiss depth psychologist, would have remained completely inexplicable to modern people. It is not chemistry, and it is not myth-building per se, as we inherit from the Greeks. It's a very complicated amalgamation, good alchemical word, very complicated amalgamation of psyche and matter. And the reason, I think, it is so resonant with our own times is because our generation, generations of people confined within the 20th century, have, in a sense, and by an oblique path, recovered that universal medicine that the alchemists dreamed of by going, strangely enough, to some of the most aboriginal and least culturally assimilated to European and American values people in the world. Shamanism is essentially a living tradition of alchemy that is not seeking the stone, but has found the stone. These shamans, these Hivaro, these Witoto, these Cubeo, notice that they have this same epistemic naivete, this inability to distinguish between subjective and objective world through the intercession of Newton and Descartes, that Frederick the Elector and the alchemists around him and the alchemists that preceded them through the centuries had. In other words, within the context of the alchemical vocabulary, the psychedelic experience as brought to us through plants, long in the possession of Aboriginal people, appears to be the identical phenomena. The Hivaro shaman, the Cubeo shaman, does not use a glass retort with cycling sulfur and mercury inside it. The shamans of the Amazon have attained a sufficient sophistication to explicitly understand that the vessel of alchemical transformation is the body and the head of the experient. This is the alchemical vessel. This is where you will encounter the three-headed dog and the queen dissolving in her bath and the incestuous couple that combine Sol and Luna to produce the white essence of the panacea of the universal medicine. These are psycho-mental processes. And Jung, strangely enough, he must have been an extraordinary person because he could approach this without psychedelics, through a very careful inspection of the dreams and the symbol-producing processes of his patients. Over decades, he produced a kind of skeletal map of the psyche. But I maintain that map doesn't fill itself in, doesn't become a living experience until we undergo what is rightly perceived as the alchemical process of dissolution. Dissolution of what? Of the lumpen prima materia of the ego. This is the shit, the tar, the coal, the dark earth of Egypt, the starting material, the loam, the manure, the night soil, the lowest matter. And we start with that, the ego, and dissolve it through the intercession of the spirit. And spirit is a complicated concept. It's not naive. It's phenomenologically difficult to define, but through the dissolving spirit of the plants. And the plants lift the the imprisoning structures of the ego, and the ego flows out into the world. And for some people, this produces panic. Panic comes from the god Pan, whose screams caused people to go mad. Panic. For other people, it's an enormous liberation. In any case, it is an influx of material previously hidden in the unconscious, laden with symbolic meaning, and eventually not to be sustained in this acidic, dissolving, roiling, liquid state. That's part of the process. But then eventually to be recombined, coagulatio, the recombining, the coagulation, the coming together at a higher level, usually through the application of a process analogous to heat, but psychic heat, which drives off the dross of false assumptions and false attachments. And all of you who have been through high-dose psychedelic experiences know that it's very hard to carry stupid baggage through that keyhole. In fact, it's just, you're lucky if you just get your soul and yourself through and intact. So what we have here, through the psychedelics, among certain marginal populations in the 20th century, freaks of all sorts in all times and places within the 20th century, a kind of almost accidental rediscovery of these alchemical truths. Well, okay, so that's good. That's one level. We can do self-directed psychotherapy on ourselves with psychedelic substances out of plants, and we can use alchemical symbolism to guide this process, and that's all very interesting. But so what? I mean, what's so great about it? Well, I think there's one of the most famous of all alchemical axioms is as above, so below, meaning always that in every small part of reality there is a tiny reflection of the great overstructure of reality. And in the largest structures are hidden the secrets of the smallest, and vice versa. We also have rediscovered this principle in the 20th century through fractal mathematics. But the psychedelics have brought us back to this alchemical mystery, shorn of any vocabulary for dealing with it, shorn of any real living notion of the spirit. And so we have sought as far afield as the Tibetan Book of the Dead, or Freudianism, or there have been various efforts to cast the psychedelic experience one way or another. The hot one now, of course, is shamanism. And I relate to that because I spent a lot of time in the Amazon and with these kinds of people with these kinds of concerns. But shamanism and alchemy are a seamless enterprise. Alchemy, the connecting figure, if you're interested in this, between the shaman and the alchemist is the smith, the worker of metal. And the shaman and the alchemist, the shaman and the smith in primitive cultures are always associated as brother figures. They both work in metals. Well, what all this means for us beyond a commitment to our own sort of ordering the Wunderkammer of our own private imagination, what it means is important, because if you look around you, the entire global civilization is undergoing some kind of meltdown. The planet itself is now to be seen as a kind of alchemical retort. The prima materia to be transformed are the nuclear stockpiles, the toxic waste dumps, the industrial wastelands, the populations devoid of hope, the populations at threat of infectious and fatal epidemic disease. There is a great deal of prima materia to be worked on at the historical level of the alchemical process. Trying to manage this rationally with some political ism, fascism, Marxism, capitalism, goes nowhere. It just digs us deeper into the mire and the muck. At the fringes, people like yourselves, people like myself, people I associate, offer endless solutions. Recycling, restraint in childbearing, increased sexual, toleration of unusual sexual styles. Many, many things are suggested, but nothing happens because the primary agenda of society has not yet been dissolved, has not yet come into a state of fluidity sufficient where a new imprint can be put upon it. In the 60s, we thought that all that had to happen was everybody would take LSD and the obvious right things to do would be done. And we expected no opposition to this because its rightness was so obvious. We didn't realize that every righteous crusade in history has marched into the waiting jaws of its oppressors. But the spirit doesn't die. It's interesting, I don't know how it's said in Europe, but in America we refer, and have always referred to freaks as bohemians. And I assumed, you hear about the left bank Bohemia of Paris in the 20s. And I always went, but why Bohemia? What does Bohemia have to do with Paris? Why are freaks called bohemians? It's because of Frederick the Elector and the alchemical renaissance that he plotted with his wife. Since that time to now, bohemian has meant a marginal political position involved with bizarre sexual practices, strange drug use, and funny ideas. Well, in the 60s then, LSD was not sufficient, even coupled with rock and roll. It only brought oppression. What it brought, it was like a failed alchemy. Instead of the dissolving and recrystallizing at a higher and more angelic level, thousands of prisons were built and the entire thing failed. But this spirit is the spirit of life itself, the spirit of novelty itself, and it will not be suppressed for long in any time or place. So now again, it comes after 30 years, after many changes, and it's among us again. And I assume, looking at all of you, that to some degree you represent this or act it out, or because it's a spirit of dissent that says we will not serve the values of materialism, the values of the ego, and the values that separate and break down the community. So here it is again. And what is different this time that we might have some greater hope of actually coming through to the beginning of the third millennium without having to hang our heads when we tell the story to our grandchildren? And I will submit to you this evening that the difference between then 1965 through 70, and now to the turn of the century, two things. First of all, we have that experience under our belt. We shall not be so stupid again. The I Ching says never confront evil directly and never name it directly because it finds weapons to defend itself. We are not an army. This is what Frederick didn't understand. He was a king, but he was not an army when it came to the White Mountain. We are not an army, so our strategy must be stealth. It's an alchemical strategy, and what do I mean by stealth? I mean the house of constipated reason must be infiltrated by art, by dreamers, by vision. And what is new is that there are massive technologies available to us, not available in the 60s. They were not designed for us. They were not intended for us. It was never ever thought that such power should flow into the hands of freaks such as ourselves. Nevertheless, through the perverse nature of the unfolding of the world, we have such tools. And I'm referring, as you probably anticipate, to the World Wide Web and the Internet. No gay kid in Montana, no Chinese scholar in Botswana, no person anywhere with a specialized interest or predilection now need feel alone. There is no aloneness. You can find your people. You know, one of the things Tim Leary said in the 60s that I always remembered, but I never heard anybody talk about or ever really heard him quote. It was a great rallying cry. It was much better than turn on, tune in, drop out. And it was this. It was find the others. Find the others. And then you will know what to do. Well, now you can find the others. You don't have to stick a flower in your hair and go to San Francisco. You just go to the web. Find the others. We all need to create affinity groups, which are subsets of the much larger community that we're part of. And then, using this technology, which was designed to keep track of us, to pick our pockets, and to sell us junk we don't want, use this technology to produce art, massive amounts of subversive art. And all art is subversive. I'm not calling for an ideological agenda. All truth which springs from the individual is subversive because, and this is a theme of mine that I'm getting more and more into the longer I live, culture is not your friend. This is an odd message for the late 90s because we're all being told, you know, you knew you were Jewish, but you forgot your Sicilian grandmother. You have to honor all of your family. Romanian, bring it forward, the dances of this, that, and the other. I hate all of this stuff. I'm Irish. It's a weird thing to be. It's a haunted, twisted people as a people. All peoples, meaning tribes, have horrible stories to tell about who they did under and who they screwed over. And when you're asked to identify with your culture, you're asked to take this on. I reject it. My brother, years ago, he invented this term. He called it extra-environmental. He said, this is what we want to be. We don't want to be Americans or Germans or English. We want to be extra-environmentalists. Always feel, wherever you go, that you are a stranger, the outsider, the one looking in. This is the viewpoint that makes all places the same to you. There's a wonderful English poet and writer, Rudyard Kipling, and he wrote a children's short story called The Cat Who Walked by Himself. And it's a story of how the dog came to the cave of man and would lay at the man's feet. But the cat would never come. And when the woman asked the cat why it would never come, it said, "I am the cat who walks by himself, and all places are alike to me." And I think transcending our cultures is going to be extraordinarily necessary for our survival. I don't think we can carry our cultures through the keyhole of the stretch of the next millennium. Well, how do you shed your culture? How do you transcend your culture? By digging into your soul with the tools that have been given you to make art. This is how cultures are transformed, by art which flows up and actually submerges the previous cultural forms. I mean, the Baroque gave way to later periods simply out of exhaustion. But notice, a style can exhaust itself and still continue, as mannerism did out of the Renaissance, for example. And when these exhausted styles are allowed to continue, they become toxic. They become moribund. It's like keeping a corpse around the house. There is an obligation to overthrow that, to produce the new, to produce the novel. And by the novel, I don't mean the literary form, I mean all things new. And then it is not the function of the artist to be the critic. The winnowing out, the deciding what is good from what is bad comes later. And that's a community process. The community decides what is good and bad art, but the individual should pour this forth. I mean, this is what you are. You are some kind of a mystery suspended between two eternities. And in that moment, when a mind looks out at a world and asks the question, what is it? In that moment, art can be created. And it is the only form of immortality that I have any certainty of. And it's available to everyone. And at the present moment, I make no distinction between art and techne. I mean, to my mind, these things are the same thing. A great turning point is in the offing. The world is changing. It's changed before, but not for a long time in our lives. Not since before our lives, but now it's changing. And there are many, many possibilities. The English biologist Dawkins invented the word meme. Do you all know what a meme is? It's the smallest unit of an idea. It's like what a gene is to biology, a meme is to ideology. And so our task is to create memes. Madonna is a meme. Catholicism is a meme. Marxism is a meme. Yellow sweaters are a meme. Create memes. Rainbow-colored dreadlocks are a meme. Launch your meme boldly and see if it will replicate, just like genes replicate, and infect and move into the organism of society. And believing as I do that society operates on a kind of biological economy, then I believe these memes are the key to societal evolution. But unless the memes are released to play the game, there's no progress. So I think the obligation on people such as ourselves, and I assume probably without exception, everybody in this room falls into the upper 5% of the Earth's population in terms of wealth, education, and freedom. Even if you're some poor pierced metalhead from the dark side of Mannheim, you have a better situation than most people on this planet, a better chance at actually reaching out toward the machinery that shapes reality and having an impact. Well, so then the question becomes, or for some people it's, well, but I have nothing to say, or I have nothing to paint, or I have nothing to communicate. Well, clearly you're not taking enough drugs then. That excuse simply will not be tolerated. If someone finds that decadent or flippant or destructive, then they don't understand what these psychedelic substances are. They open the doorway to creativity. They cleanse the doors of perception. And then, as Blake said, reality is perceived as it truly is, as infinite. Part of what is wrong with our society, and hence with ourselves, is that we consume images. We don't produce them. We need to produce, not consume media. The media is a huge issue. You can't escape it. So what are you going to do about it? The only solution is to drive it, to take charge. Otherwise, you will be poisoned by it. And as more and more people are waking up to this, essentially we are seeing, I think, a huge artistic revolution, a revolution in values that reaches into science, that reaches into politics, that reaches into every aspect of life, but that is coming from the imagination, thoroughly stimulated and activated by the discovery of all these natural and synthetic substances which perturb the mind. And I'm not denying that a certain amount of social chaos goes along with this, but on the other hand, I can point to pretty psychedelically pure centuries like the 13th in Europe, and there was still plenty of social chaos going on. I don't think you can lay social chaos at the feet of psychedelics. I think social chaos is an inimical part of the system. What psychedelics do is they give a direction to that chaos, a dimension of vertical ascent, because inevitably out of the psychedelic situation emerges not despair, not self-indulgence, but wild-eyed idealism. That's the inevitable product of any psychedelically driven social process. How well that idealistic idea then brokers its way to the throne, if it does, is another issue. I don't know if I've hit this technological thing hard enough. I hope that you all avail yourselves of the power of the internet. In years past, in speaking to audiences in America, it was maddening to me to find that the environmentalists, the feminists, the gays, the psychedelic people, and I'm not sure if I got everybody, and the space people, the colonization people, none of these people had anything to say to each other. They didn't seem to realize that their marginality united them far more than any difference they might perceive in their positions. And they didn't seem to realize that their political disempowerment was a product of their inability to make common cause with people similarly motivated or similarly motivated toward social change. So it's very important to build an inclusive community, and a community that has a sense of direction. And I think the internet empowers this far more than any other tool that has been handed to us except psychedelics. And if you take psychedelics and the internet and music and put all of that together, you have the basis for a new community that is wider and deeper than you know. The people who are building the new machines, who are designing the new circuitry, who are writing the new code, are all freaks. I mean, they work for capitalist dogs, of course, because we all do. But the creative thrust of these technologies is being driven by people just like you and me. And I think this is all tremendously positive. So, where am I in all of this? Well, I'm getting there. I'm getting there. And then finally, I guess, and I'll just close on this, the alchemical return. All culture is some kind of myth. All cultural stories, then, have a psychic dynamic to them, which is not suspected by the civilization as it lives these myths. It has to be seen from outside. And there is a consistent myth in let's call it just Western civilization without being too precise, a consistent myth. In the early Jews, you get it as the idea that God will enter history. With Christianity, you get it with the idea that man and God can be consubstantial. Again, in Islam, the insistence that God will enter history. And then modern science, strangely enough, dumps all of this theology, but maintains the idea that man can become as a god. In other words, the myth that is consistent throughout the entire Western experience is the myth of some kind of defining progressive experience. Well, now we have the power to realize this myth in some kind of, for want of a better word, an alchemical utopia. And I think it's very interesting that at this very high-tech moment in our adventure, the plants return, the humblest of all biology. The plants return and almost stand before us as a beacon and a promise. Have you noticed that plants do all their business with dirt and air? This is something we only wish we could do. Build an industrial society based on nothing more than the ambient dirt and the air flowing past. Building sugars and carbohydrates out of gaseous oxygen. I mean, this is quite a trick. The plants stand both in the psychedelic sense, but then in the larger sense of the vegetable kingdom, they stand for absolute Tao. They stand for the correct way for life to relate to its environment, effortlessly recycling, vegetatively propagating when necessary, sexually propagating when necessary, immune to pain, patient to the tune of centuries, always building up structure, always maintaining a leavening effect upon the land. All of these qualities of caregiving and well, notice, for example, that all the processes of biology occur below the boiling point of water. If we could build societies that did that, we work in the range of hundreds of degrees, thousands of degrees, fusing metals and creating toxicity. So I think the psychedelic plant revolution, which is leading toward the nanotechnological revolution. In other words, the imitating of nature at the atomic level in building of machines and the management of processes. What all of this is leading toward is a rarefaction, a good alchemical word, a rarefaction of the human imprint on this planet, a spiritualization of humanity, and a new order of mind, part machine, part human. Notice that the internet and the computers that it serves are actually made of the materials of the earth. They're largely metals, silicon, glass, copper, gold, silver. These are the products of demonic artifice. These are the things which the alchemists dreamed of. They transform space and time. They allow us to speak at a distance. They allow us to wander through libraries thousands of miles distant. No fact is too obscure, no person so hidden that you can't reach them. It is, in a way, the perfection of the magical ideal that was developed and unfortunately prematurely launched by Frederick the Elector and his wife here nearby at Heidelberg. And so I'm involved, as I said, in a process of bringing this story to many people who haven't heard it. It's a great story. It's a great myth that the underground community should make its own. And, you know, I used it this evening just as the scaffold for this talk, but I tried to hit the things that are important to me, which are psychedelics, recovery of archaic lifestyles, use of media to subvert existing paradigms, empowerment of the individual through dissolving the ego through psychedelics, and I don't know, whatever else. So thank you for your patience and indulgence, and if you have any questions, I'd be glad to answer. Anybody or not? No, it was all perfectly clear? All is klar, yeah? An hour ago, I didn't know I would stand on this stage, so before you give your attention to me, I'd like you to give your attention to the person sitting next to you, to the person sitting behind you. You see, political circumstances have forced us to camouflage ourselves. We look pretty much like everybody else, but an event like this brings us out of the woodwork. This is your community. This is your affinity group. Whatever you need, somebody in this room knows how to get it. So... So it's not necessarily the four dicks on the stage that are going to lead you into a new world. It's what you do for yourself to make this inner journey. As Tim's mentioned, we've all been down in Linz thinking about virtual reality. And of course, for an American to come to Germany is to think about the great changes that are happening here. And I kept asking myself, what is the uniting theme between psychedelics, virtual reality, and Germany? And the answer is radical freedom. Yeah. Radical freedom. Radical freedom doesn't mean giving somebody the vote. Radical freedom means the right to take over and control our own destiny and the destiny of this planet. Radical freedom means recovering our birthright. What would you think if somebody attempted to take your sexuality away from you? In the suppression of the psychedelic experience, the masters who make the rules have taken away a major slice of what it is to be a human being. This is intolerable. We have been robbed of our birthright by the frightened, the constipated, the narrow-minded, the stupid, and the afraid. Yeah. Take back your mind. Take back your mind. That is the message. Now, the psychedelic experience is always criticized, irrelevant, narcissistic, self-indulgent. No, the psychedelic experience is the replay of human history in the individual mind. Right. If you don't know where you came from, you don't know who you are. Part of this movement into the future is a recapturing of the archaic, the ancient, the prehistorical. And Tim said it right. That's the Cro-Magnon religion of orgy, psychedelic ecstasy, and group sex. Well, how do we get from where we are to where we want to be, and why is it so difficult? Well, I think it's difficult because we have a lousy way of communicating. We communicate with words. Words are small mouth noises. Small mouth noises are a very low-grade channel of communication. What virtual reality holds out is the possibility that we can create a language where we see what we mean. If we could see what we mean, we would have a kind of telepathy. Anyway, the last point I want to make, because I think this is very important, we all talk about psychedelics, the impact on ourselves, the individual experience. But what are they when you look at 1 million psychedelic trips? What does it do to society? What it does is it dissolves boundaries. It dissolves the ultimate boundary, which is the ultimate fucka, which is ego. Ego is something invented by frightened people 20,000 years ago as a way to suppress women, as a way to suppress sexuality, as a way to suppress the wonder inherent in the world. Psychedelics are catalysts for the human imagination. We were called forth out of monkey existence by the fact that we had strange eating habits. And the consequence of those strange eating habits is now a monkey can dream of transforming its collective soul into a flying saucer. This is the goal that lies ahead at the end of history. History doesn't go on endlessly fluctuating centuries into the future. History is leading toward the transformation of this planet in our lifetime. A cybernetic, biological, psychedelic being. The collectivity, not only of humanity, but of all life on Earth, is struggling to be born. The entire universe of matter is the womb of mind, and it is the task of human beings to lead the collectivity of humanity out of the labyrinth of matter and into the realm of the imagination. The imagination is where we're all going to live. The imagination is the only place where the human soul is at home.
Better paper. Okay. You want to take a riff, Terence? Come on.
Well, listening to Tim, one thing occurred to me that I wanted to leave with you, and that is what this is all about in political terms is the empowerment of direct experience. We all are sold a bill of goods. Maybe you remember the Bob Dylan song where he says, "It is not he or she or them or it that you belong to." This is what psychedelics teach you. We're not going to learn it from Der Spiegel, from Time magazine. It doesn't come like that. Direct experience, your opinion, your feelings, your sexuality is the only real thing in your universe. Don't transfer loyalty to ideology, to money, to party, to friends. All of these things are outside of the core of your reality, and centuries of programming have been laid on to all of us to take away the power of our own direct experience. This is why psychedelics are illegal. They don't care whether people jump out of windows or any of that. They're not interested in public health. They do not want people to take back their minds. And we're going to take back our minds. Soon. The sooner the better. That's really, to my mind, the bottom line. That's why this thing has potential world consequences, because an empowered individual in touch with their own existential core can do what that guy did with the 18 tanks. It was an idea that stopped the tanks, and it was an idea expressed not over state radio, not through the newspapers, but by one person taking a stand. You know, a great American philosopher, and I hope it was Emerson, said, no, it was Emerson, said, if you are right, you are a majority of one. You are a majority of one. And this is what we all need to realize. We are responsible for ourselves, and we will set the agenda for the human future. The mushrooms once said to me, you must have a plan. If you don't have a plan, you will become part of somebody else's plan.
It's not my job to give you answers, and anyone that expects answers has come to the wrong place.
So you ask
Think for yourself. Think for yourself. Question authority. Don't look for answers. Think up some answers of your own. Once again, thanks to Heidelberg and Mannheim. Thanks to Werner Pieper. Let the party go on. We'll see you out there. So long.
McLuhan, I don't know how many of you recall him from the 60s, but he had, for a very brief period of time, about 5 or 6 years, an extraordinary influence on American culture. You couldn't pick up a magazine or turn on the TV without hearing McLuhan, what he said, what he thought, what he predicted. He was consulting with Madison Avenue, with politicians, with Hollywood, so forth and so on. And his influence, he died in the early 70s, and his influence died with him. Even though he had founded the Center for Media Study at the University of Toronto in Canada, he really seemed to spawn no highly visible successors. It was a unique personality and breakthrough, much in the same way that Joyce was a unique personality and spawned very few imitators. And the irony of all this is that McLuhan did his journeyman work before he burst onto the world stage as this mysterious savant of media. He did his work as a Joyce scholar. That's what he was, a literary critic, Joyce scholar, medievalist, that sort of thing. And then in the early 50s or middle 50s, he wrote a book which I've never read, it's very hard to find, called The Mechanical Bride, that was his first testing of his ideas. McLuhan is primarily understood as a communication theorist or a philosopher of media. And that's what he talked about. He turned the analytical Western deconstructionist method on the technologies of communication, printing, film, photography, dance, theater, even such things as money he thought of as forms of media. And he carried out and analyzed these various forms of media and reached very controversial conclusions. One of the things that was puzzling to me as I went back through and read all this is one of the things was McLuhan was synonymous with incomprehensibility in the 60s. I mean, the whole thing was, who can understand this guy? You know, he's like Buddha, he speaks these words, but we can't understand. Well, now, 25, 30 years later, it reads pretty straightforwardly, and most of what he's predicted has come to pass. I think even McLuhan would be amazed at the speed with which the Gutenberg world has been overturned. I mean, there's no hint in here of home computers, let alone interactive networks, virtual reality, phone sex, and so forth and so on. But this was all grist for the McLuhan-esque mill, and he would have, had he lived, had much to say on this. It surprised me in reading this stuff how demanding it is on your own literacy. I mean, he assumes basically that the people he's talking to have read everything and have understood it. I mean, from Homer to Rabelais to Chaucer to Mad Magazine, he assumes you have a complete knowledge of modern film and popular print journalism and popular culture. All of this was grist for his mill. I'll show you the books I'm reading from and talking about, and then I'll actually read you a section of McLuhan, because it's like Joyce, it's a stylistic thing that you can't really encompass without getting your feet wet. This was his best-known book, probably, and this is the original paperback edition. This book was immensely discussed when it came out, and probably very little read, judging by the quality of the discussion. Understanding Media, the Extensions of Man. This is how most people heard of McLuhan. And he followed it up with the Gutenberg Galaxy. These are all first editions. These books I don't think are in print. Few intellectuals in this century have fallen so totally through the cracks as McLuhan. The Gutenberg Galaxy, very interesting. I'm going to read from some of it tonight. It's organized around chapter headings such as, does the interiorization of media, such as letters, alter the ratio among our senses and change mental processes? Or Pope's Dunciad indicates the printed book as the agent of a primitivistic and romantic revival. Sheer visual quantity evokes the magical resonance of the tribal horde. The box office looms as a return to the echo chamber of bardic incantation. That's a chapter heading. Topography cracked the voices of silence, and one of my favorite, Heidegger surfboards along on the electronic wave as triumphantly as Descartes rode the mechanical wave. So there's a lot of fun in McLuhan, and this comes out of his being a Joyce scholar. You just can't mess with that without fun. This is his third book with Harley Parker, Through the Vanishing Point, Space in Poetry and Painting. And I guess I should say, a few years ago, somebody asked me to review McLuhan's letters, which had been published, which I did. It was Gnosis or somebody. Anyway, it brought back to me, he was a convert to Catholicism, and an extraordinarily complex intellectual with a medievalist who became a Joyce scholar, who became a communications expert. And in McLuhan there is a very deep strain of nostalgia for the essence of the medieval world, of what he called manuscript culture. And essentially his entire output is a critique of print and of the impact of print on culture. And I think, though he attempted to be fairly even-handed, his final resolution of all this was that it had many detrimental and distorting effects on the Western mind. This is another little book he published back in the heyday, and he experimented with topographic layout, somewhat hearkening back to the surrealists, whom he discusses a great deal. And there was something about, it was his fascination with topographical layout that also brought him into such congruence with the Wake. So let me read you a section from the Gutenberg Galaxy that is both interesting to think about, or, if you can't understand it, then an interesting example of what McLuhan's style was like, and what I mean by that he was an extraordinarily demanding intellectual. He doesn't cut you much slack. This is a short section called "Only a Fraction of the History of Literacy Has Been Typographic." Till now, we have been concerned mostly with the written word as it transfers or translates the audio-tactile space of sacral, non-literate man into the visual space of civilized or literate or profane man. Once this transfer or metamorphosis occurs, we are soon in the world of books, scribal or typographic. The rest of our concern will be with books, written and printed, and the results for learning and society. From the 5th century BC to the 15th century AD, the book was a scribal product. Only 1/3 of the history of the book in the Western world has been typographic. It is not incongruous, therefore, to say, as G.S. Brett does in Psychology, Ancient and Modern, and here's the quote, "The idea that knowledge is essentially book learning seems to be a very modern view, probably derived from the medieval distinctions between clerk and layman, with additional emphasis provided by the literary character of the rather fantastic humanism of the 16th century. The original and natural idea of knowledge is that of cunning, or the possession of wits. Odysseus is the original type of thinker, a man of many ideas, who could overcome the Cyclops and achieve a significant triumph of mind over matter. Knowledge is thus a capacity for overcoming the difficulties of life and achieving success in this world." So that closes the quote. Then McLuhan comments, Brett here specifies the natural dichotomy which the book brings into any society, in addition to the split within the individual of that society. The work of James Joyce exhibits a complex clairvoyance in these matters. His Leopold Bloom of Ulysses, a man of many ideas and many devices, is a freelance salesman. Joyce saw the parallels on one hand between the modern frontier of the verbal and the pictorial, and on the other between the Homeric world poised between the old sacral culture and the new profane or literate sensibility. Bloom, the newly detribalized Jew, is presented in modern Dublin, a slightly detribalized Irish world. Such a frontier is the modern world of the advertisement, congenial, therefore, to the transitional culture of Bloom. In the 17th or Ithaca episode of Ulysses, we read, "What were habitually his final meditations? Of some one sole unique advertisement, to cause passers to stop in wonder, a poster novelty with all extraneous accretions excluded, reduced to its simplest and most efficient terms, not exceeding the span of casual vision and congruous with the velocity of modern life." In the books at the Wake, James S. Atherton points out, and here's Atherton's quote, "Amongst other things, Finnegan's Wake is a history of writing. We begin with writing on a bone, a pebble, a ram skin, leave them to cook in the mothering pot, and Guten Morg with his Cro-Magnon charter, tinting fats and great prime, must once for omnibus step rubric red out of the word press. The mothering pot is an allusion to alchemy, but there is some other significance connected with writing, for the next time the word appears, it is again in a context concerning improvement in systems of communication. The passage is, "All the Irish signics of her dip and dump help a bit from an Father Hogum till the mutter maskins." Dip and dump help a bit combine the deaf and dumb alphabet signs in the air, or Irish signs, with the ups and downs of the ordinary ABC and the more pronounced up and downs of Irish Ogham writing. The Mason, following this, must be the man of that name who invented steel pen nibs. But all I can suggest for mother is the mothering of Freemasons, which does not fit the context, although they, of course, also make signs in the air. Is that perfectly clear? Now back to McLuhan. Guten Morg, with his Cro-Magnon charter, expounds by mythic gloss the fact that writing meant the emergence of the caveman or sacral man from the audio world of simultaneous resonance into the profane world of daylight. The reference to the Masons is to the world of the bricklayer as a type of speech itself. On the second page of the Wake, Joyce is making a mosaic, an Achilles shield, as it were, of all the themes and modes of human speech and communication. Big Meister Finnegan of the stuttering hand, Freeman's Maurer, lived in the broadest way immarginable in his rush-lit too far back for massages, before Joshuan judges had given us numbers. Joyce is, in the Wake, making his own Altamira cave drawings of the entire history of the human mind, in terms of its basic gestures and postures during all phases of human culture and technology. As his title indicates, he saw that the wake of human progress can disappear again into the night of sacral or auditory man. the Finn cycle of tribal institutions can return in the electric age, but if again, then let's make it awake, or both. Joyce could see no advantage in our remaining locked up in each cultural cycle as in a trance or dream. He discovered the means of living simultaneously in all cultural modes while quite conscious. This means he cites for such self-awareness and correction of cultural bias in his kaleidoscope. This term indicates the interplay and colloidal mixture of all components of human technology as they extend our senses and shift their ratios in the social kaleidoscope of cultural clash, deor, savage, the oral or sacral, scope, the visual or profane, and civilized. So, that's his comment. Only a fraction of the history of literacy has been typographic. These people, Joyce, to some degree Pound, McLuhan, they were the prophets of the world in which we now stand. The world of integrated, interactive media, extraordinary data retrieval that erases the 17th century notion of the unconscious. Nothing is now unconscious if your data search commands are powerful enough. And the remaking of the human image that required centuries for print, the transition that we talked about in here from scribal culture to true book culture occupied 500 years. The transition from book culture to electronic culture has occurred in less than 50 years. I mean, it's eerie to read his examples of contemporaneity because there's stuff like Marilyn Monroe, Perry Como, James Dean. I mean, he's writing from another era, and yet from his point of view, he's firmly embedded in a kind of super future that we are now able to look back on. Here's another section that I think makes some of this more clear. The name of this section is, "The medieval book trade was a second-hand trade, even as with the dealing today in old masters." From the 12th century onward, the rise of the universities brought masters and students into the field of book production in class time, and these books found their way back to the monastic libraries when students returned after completing their studies. A number of these standard textbooks, of which approved exemplars were kept for copying by the stationari of the universities, naturally found their way into print quite early, for many of them contained in undiminished request in the 15th century as before. These official university texts offer no problems of origin or nomenclature. And then he's quoting Goldschmidt. He adds, "Soon after 1300, the expensive vellum could be dispensed with, and the cheaper paper made the accumulation of many books a matter of industry rather than... Since, however, the student went to lectures pen in hand, and it was the lecturer's task to dictate the book he was expounding to his audience, there is a great body of reporterata which constitute a very complex problem for editors." So really, like for Joyce, for McLuhan, the book is the central symbol of the age, the central mystery of our time. In a sense, I sort of share that notion. It's a very Talmudic notion. It's a very psychedelic notion. It's the idea that somehow the career of the word is the central overarching metaphor of the age. And naturally, if the book is the central metaphor for reality, then reality itself is seen as somehow literary, somehow textual. And this, in fact, is how I think reality was seen until the rise of modern science. We're always taught, that the roots of modern science go back to Democritean atomism, which is, of course, true. But the number of people who knew that 1,000 years ago was probably very few. The real notion out of which science had to divest itself is the notion of a book, or if that seems too concrete, a story, a narrative, the story of man's fall and redemption. That was what the Christian exegesis of post-Edenic time was all about. With the rise of modern science, the idea of narrative has become somewhat overthrown. McLuhan would say that narrative persisted far beyond its utility because the biases of print kept it in place for such a long time. Everyone assumes that tools are tools and you use them and that's that. For McLuhan, the entirety of the toolkit of modern Western man can be traced to the unconscious assumptions of print. For example, the idea of the individual, which is a pretty personal notion, right there and close to the heart. The idea of the individual is a post-medieval concept, legitimized by print. The idea of the public, this concept did not exist before newspapers, because before newspapers there was no public. There were only people, and rulers very rarely bothered to pass on their thinking to anybody other than their closest associates, and then only for utilitarian reasons. The notion of an observing citizenry somehow sharing the governance of society, this again is a print-created idea. The idea of interchangeable parts, without which our world would hardly function. There would not be automobiles, buildings, aircraft, interchangeable parts. That's an idea that comes from the interchangeability of letters in a printer's block. All that was the first industry to ever utilize the concept of easily reformulated subunits. And it's strange, the Chinese get credit for inventing printing thousands and thousands of years before Europe, but they would carve a single block of wood and print it. They didn't get the notion of movable type. And movable type, the distribution of books becomes the paradigmatic model for the distribution of any product. It's produced, it's edited, it's manufactured, it's sold, and then sequels are spawned. All products have followed this model, but books were one of the earliest mass manufactured objects to be put through this cycle. Modern city planning, the linearity of it, the way in which land surveys are carried out, these are all unconscious biases imbibed from the world of print. And they make sense if you're a print head. But one of the peculiar things notice that animals do not possess language. Many human societies do not possess writing, and very few human societies, and only 2 on Earth, invented printing. And yet once invented, it feeds back into the evolution of social structures and defines everything. And yet it's an extraordinary artificiality. And we have been imprisoned in it for hundreds and hundreds of years now. Now it is breaking down. And we are changing to a different sensory ratio. And you might suppose, if you hadn't given this a lot of thought, that the new electronic media, television, and so forth, would carry us into an entirely different sensory ratio. McLuhan felt differently. He felt that it was restoring us to a medieval sensory ratio. He felt that a television screen is much more like an illuminated manuscript than a page of print. The distinction may seem subtle at first, but if you're looking at an illuminated medieval manuscript, notice I said looking, you must look in order to understand.
More than the simple words I try to say, I only live to love you more each day. More than you'll ever know, my arms long to hold you, so my life will be in your keeping, waking, sleeping, laughing, weeping, longer than always is a long, long time. But far beyond forever you'll be mine. I know I've never lived before, and my heart is very sure no one else.
Reading is not looking. Reading is an entirely different kind of behavior. As a child, you learn what an E looks like, what a printed lowercase e looks like. After seeing 20, 100, 1,000, 10,000, you know what it looks like. You have an expectation of the gestalt of the lowercase e, and nobody opens a book and looks at print unless there's some extraordinary abstract discussion going on. We read print, but we look at manuscript because manuscript carries the intrinsic signification of the individual who made it. And his or her idiosyncrasies have to be parsed through to get the meaning. Similarly with television, television is a very low resolution media. I mean, these are little pieces of light, pixels flying back and forth, and they must be looked at. They cannot be read. And it's an extraordinarily engaging process. That's why it creates an entirely different set of social biases than print does. And McLuhan called these biases, and this was the one distinction or one idea of his that made its way into popular culture. He distinguished between what he called hot and cold media. And usually people botch this every time because nobody really, to this day, understands exactly what he meant. So let me read you a little bit about this distinction. This is in Chapter 2 of Understanding Media, and Chapter 2 is called Media, Hot and Cold. The rise of the waltz, explained Kurt Sachs in The World History of the Dance, was a result of that longing for truth, simplicity, closeness to nature, and primitivism with which the last two-thirds of the 18th century fulfilled. In the century of jazz, we are likely to overlook the emergence of the waltz as a hot and explosive human expression that broke through the formal feudal barriers of courtly and choral dance styles. But obviously it was, I mean, when you contrast it to what came before. There is a basic principle that distinguishes a hot medium like radio from a cool one like the telephone, or a hot medium like the movie from a cool one like TV. A hot medium is one that extends one single sense in high definition. High definition is the state of being well filled with data. I love that. A photograph is visually high definition. A cartoon is low definition simply because very little visual information is provided. Telephone is a cool medium, or one of low definition, because the ear is given a meager amount of information. And speech is a cool medium of low definition because so little is given and so much has to be filled in by the listener. On the other hand, hot media do not leave so much to be filled in or completed by the audience. Hot media are, therefore, low in participation, and cool media are high in participation or completion by the audience. Naturally, therefore, a hot medium like the radio has very different effects on the user from a cool medium like the television. A cool medium, like hieroglyphic or ideogrammic written characters, has very different effects from the hot and explosive medium of the phonetic alphabet. The alphabet, when pushed to a high degree of abstract visual intensity, became typography. The printed word, with its specialist intensity, burst the bonds of medieval corporate guilds and monasteries, creating extreme individualist patterns of enterprise and monopoly. But the typical reversal occurred when extremes of monopoly brought back the corporation with its impersonal empire over many lives. The hotting up of the medium of writing to repeatable Prince intensity led to nationalism and the religious wars of the 16th century. The heavy and unwieldy media, such as stone, are time binders. Used for writing, they are very cool indeed and serve to unify the age, whereas paper is a hot medium that serves to unify spaces horizontally, both in political and entertainment empires. And he just goes on like this endlessly. I mean, this was his métier, or his media, to connect and comment on this stuff. And television really was both his own media for reaching a very large audience. In fact, I remember the excitement that swept through. I didn't even have a television. I was living in Berkeley at the time, and somebody said, we have to go up to the student union at 6 o'clock because Mike Wallace is interviewing Marshall McLuhan. And it seemed an incredibly freaky notion that McLuhan would be on TV. It shows you what a stultified, categorically different world we were living in at the time. Here's just a little bit of McLuhan on television. This is chapter 31 of Understanding Media, The Timid Giant. Perhaps the most familiar and pathetic effect of the TV image is the posture of children in the early grades. Since children, regardless of eye condition, average about 6.5 inches from the printed page. Our children are striving to carry over to the printed page the all-involving sensory mandate of the TV image. With perfect psychomimetic skill, they carry out the commands of the TV image. They pore, they probe, they slow down and involve themselves in depth. This is what they had learned to do in the cool iconography of the comic book medium. TV carried the process much further. Suddenly they are transferred to the hot print medium with its uniform patterns and fast lineal movement. Pointlessly they strive to read print in depth. They bring to print all their senses, and print rejects them. Print asks for the isolated and stripped down visual faculty, not for the unified sensorium, you see. So often very unexpected, paradoxical insights emerge from this stuff. And in this book that he did with Harley Parker, Through the Vanishing Point, Space in Poetry and Painting, it's an interesting technique. They take a number of works of art, either literature, such as the Song from Love's Labour Lost by William Shakespeare, or the Ballade de Bonconcieux of Geoffrey Chaucer, or the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, and then comment on it, and also visual arts, because McLuhan really felt that the art historical and technological and architectural output of Western civilization could be essentially psychoanalyzed, could be seen as the tracings of the mass consciousness. And he felt that the evolution of sensory ratios within historical time had been very, very rapid. That, for example, he talks about how St. Augustine was a person of great piety and learning, and people doubting this would show him an open page of scripture or theological disputation, and he would look at it for a few minutes, and then they would close the book, and he could tell them what was written there. And this was taken as proof of his piety. He was, as far as we can tell, the only man in Europe who could read silently at that time. This was a period when the audial pre-scribal culture was still being assimilated. McLuhan spends a lot of time analyzing this episode in the 14th century when the laws of perspective spring suddenly into being, as somewhat in the way, very similar in the way that fractal mathematics have introduced us to a new superspace. For the Renaissance, spatial perspective was essentially a filing system for visual data. At last they knew where to put everything and where to look for it once they had put it there, which if you have a pre-perspectivist arrangement of space, you have to look, not read, look at each painting in order to locate where the information is. This is, again, this read-look dichotomy. McLuhan never discussed psychedelics, but psychedelics, I think, clearly are an extension of these kinds of media that you have to engage with, that you have to look at, that you cannot read, you cannot take for granted. And these give back a much more complex world. I mean, notice that the world created by print is a world of gestalts, buildings, highways, bridges. We know how these things are supposed to look. We don't experience astonishment each time we enter a home or an institutional edifice. There is a built-in set of syntactical expectations in linear space, And when those are violated, this is very noticeable and becomes the basis for architectural or design innovation or something like that. I think that what's happening, and I think that this would be McLuhan's take, is that all of these new media that attempt to suppress the appurtenances of media are in fact having the effect of returning us to an archaic sense. And McLuhan was on to this. He is the one who coined the phrase electronic feudalism. And he felt that we were headed back toward the medieval sensory ratio because he saw television as like manuscript. But I think had he lived into the era of VR, psilocybin, HD TV, and implants, he would have seen we're not reaching back to the medieval. That was simply a stepping stone to the archaic, and that we are going beyond the entire domain of scribal humanity and actually reaching back to a shamanic, feeling-toned kind of thing. And all of the breakdown of linearity that you see in the 20th century, abstract expressionism, Dada, jazz, rock and roll, non-figurative painting, LSD, all of these things on one level can be seen as I've said, as harking back to the archaic. But on another level, what they can be seen as are new behaviors emerging as the cloud of print-constellated constipation is lifted. It's breaking down. An interesting question that we would put to McLuhan if we had him here tonight, I think, is to what degree can what he said about television not be applied to HD TV? It seems to me that HD TV is television without the biases of TV. And, you know, a perfect medium is an invisible. A perfect media is an invisible media. And print is the least invisible of all media. I mean, print is an incredible Rube Goldberg invention for conveying information. Here's McLuhan on this same subject rather than me dwelling on it. This is from the Gutenberg Galaxy. This is a section called "A Theory of Cultural Change is Impossible Without Knowledge of the Changing Sense Ratios Effected by Various Externalizations of Our Senses," in other words, by media. It is very much worth dwelling on this matter, since we can see that from the invention of the alphabet, there has been a continuous drive in the Western world toward the separation of the senses, of functions, of operations, of states emotional and political, as well as of tasks, a fragmentation which terminated, thought Durkheim, in the anomie of the 19th century. The paradox presented by Professor von Bexy is that the two-dimensional mosaic is in fact a multidimensional world of interstructural resonance. It is the three-dimensional world of pictorial space that is indeed an abstract illusion built on the intense separation of the visual from the other senses. There is here no question of values or preferences. It is necessary, however, for any other kind of understanding to know why primitive drawing is two-dimensional, whereas the drawing and painting of literate human beings tends toward perspective. Without this knowledge, we cannot grasp why people ever cease to be primitive or audio-tactile in their sense bias, nor could we ever understand why men have sense saison, that's in quotes, abandoned the visual in favor of the audio-tactile modes of awareness and of organization of experience. This matter clarified we can much more easily approach the role of alphabet and of printing in giving a dominant role to the visual sense in language and art, and in the entire range of social and political life. For until we have upgraded the visual component, communities know only a tribal structure. The detribalizing individual, in the past at least, depended on an intense visual life fostered by literacy, and by literacy of the alphabetic kind alone. For alphabetic writing is not unique, but late. There had been much writing before it. In fact, any people that ceases to be nomadic and pursues sedentary modes of work is ready to invent writing. No merely nomadic people ever had writing any more than they ever developed architecture or enclosed space. For writing is a visual enclosure of non-visual spaces and senses. It is therefore an abstraction of the visual from the ordinary sense interplay, and whereas speech is an utterance of all our senses at once, writing abstracts from speech. That's very interesting, isn't it? That this association of nomadism to the inability to create architectonic space and therefore no writing. That a word is a structure, a written word is a structure, and therefore no nomad would ever do such a thing. Interesting. I think he's saying reading is not seeing. And those who read do not see. Even when they lift their eyes from their books, they carry the attitude of print into the world. They attempt to read nature. And you can't read nature. You must look at nature. You must see nature. Certainly, I think in my own life, I was thinking about this a few months ago, and it surprised me. I'm trying to think of the books that really influenced my life, and I thought of, Moby Dick and Huxley's Doors of Perception. But then when I really got down on it, I realized that a little tiny book Huxley wrote that my mother pushed on me when I was about 12 years old, called The Art of Seeing, probably shaped me as much as anything. And in there, it's a very McLuhan-esque rap without McLuhan-esque terminology. And he says the way to overcome, and I think this is very, very, very intelligent and simple advice. Huxley said the way to overcome the print bias, and God knows he was a Cambridge-educated gentleman steeped in the traditions of English literacy and intellectualism, is freehand drawing. Draw. Train your eye. Draw nudes, draw seashells, draw insects, and go into nature and train the eye to see, and you will cease to read the world. And readers are emotionally, a seeing person does not want to form a relationship with a reading person. This conflict that we get between men and women and between people about, which we call the head-heart conflict, is really a reading-seeing conflict. It isn't a head and heart. It's that readers and seers cannot relate to each other's emotional life because they seem to come from such different worlds. So yeah, I think you have a very good point, and the permission to abstract from nature that print created is why we have such a terrible culture crisis, because just a kind of a trivial example, it was said by Marshall McLuhan, strangely enough, that the Vietnam War could not be won the way an ordinary war is won because the citizenry of this country couldn't tolerate the sight of what war was. and that modern warfare became impossible when it could be televised into the living room, because war is something that you must read about. You must not see it. It must be this grand thing of the distant clash of armies and young heroes being created. But when it turns into amputation and maggots and screams of pain, the political fun goes out of it. So war is therefore a literary activity. And, you know, the one argument that can be made, I think, in television's favor is people don't like to see images of violence. But if we have to show so much violence on television, let it always be real. The violence is only indefensible when it's vicarious. If it's real violence, you need to see it, because it's happening in a world for which you bear a partial moral responsibility. And I think warfare has been remade by media in that sense. A lot of politics has been remade because imperial doings are usually ugly, brutal, and not something that you want to exhibit before the populace. And yet modern media makes that very difficult to avoid. You know, you get the notion of public morality, or, you know, the people won't stand for this. We have to get this story out. The people won't stand for this. Well, now, this is a moral dimension inconceivable in medieval or Roman times. I mean, what would it mean to say the people won't stand for this? So there's an attempt to create, through the collectivity, a kind of community of moral judgment. The medium is the message means that the medium is the thing which is making the difference. In every discussion you ever hear since the 60s about TV, for example, is it good, is it bad, terrible, wonderful, the discussion hinges around what's on TV. And people say, well, television is terrible, it just shows violence. And then somebody else says, no, television is wonderful, those nature shows and news from far away and masterpiece theater. This is a stupid argument. What McLuhan meant by the media is the message, is he meant that it doesn't matter what you put on TV. TV is TV. It has an intrinsic nature. And whether you're showing National Geographic specials or slasher movies, TV will do what it does. It has certain qualities, just like driving a car or skiing. Certain muscles are going to be exercised, certain perceptual systems enhanced, others suppressed. And it's very hard for us to understand this because we have accepted this media so thoroughly into our life. But in fact, it is shaping our value systems in ways that are very hard for us to suspect or even detect. I mean, television, for example, it's a drug. It has a series of measurable physiological parameters that are as intrinsically its signature as the parameters of heroin are its signature. I mean, you sit somebody down in front of a TV set and turn it on, 20 minutes later come back, sample their blood pressure, their eye movement rate, blood is pooling in their rear end, their breathing takes on a certain quality, the stare reflex sets in. I mean, they are thoroughly zoned on a drug. And when you think about the fact that the average American watches 6.5 hours of television a day, imagine if a drug had been introduced in 1948 that we all spent 6.5 hours per day on average watching. And the one thing about drugs in their defense is that it's very hard to diddle the message. A drug is a mirror, But television isn't a mirror. Television is a billboard, and anybody who pays their money can put their message into the trip. This is an extraordinarily insidious situation. What McLuhan wanted to become, I think, was the founder of a general new sophistication about media. And he was essentially parodied to death by, guess what? Media. They made of him an icon of cultural incomprehensibility. Not since Einstein have you been so pre-programmed in advance to believe you ain't going to understand this guy. And that's what they said about McLuhan, and consequently his message and his insight failed. We will have to reinvent McLuhan around the turn of the century, because we are producing forms of media of such interactive power and potential social impact that we're going to have to go back and rethink all of this. Finnegan's Wake is the last and most ambitious and most puzzling work of the British writer James Joyce, who of course wrote Dubliners and Ulysses. And if Ulysses is the algebra of literature, then Finnegan's Wake is the partial differential equation. Most of us break down at algebra. Few of us aspire to go on to the partial linear differential equation. In some ways, I think it can arguably said that this is the quintessential work of art, or at least work of literature, of the 20th century. And Joyce intended it that way. Joseph Campbell called it a staggering allegory of the fall and redemption of mankind. Equally respected critics have called it a surrender to the crossword puzzle portion of the human mind. So the main thing about it is that it is linguistically dense. It is dense on every level. It has over 63,000 individual words in it. That's more words than most fictional manuscripts have, words, period. It has over 5,000 characters in it. Ulysses was designed as a kind of, Joyce thought of it as his day book. It follows the peregrinations of an ordinary Dubliner, this is Ulysses, an ordinary Dubliner, through the vicissitudes of his day, his struggles to buy some kidneys to fry for breakfast, his chance meeting with his wife's lover, so forth and so on. Fairly straightforward exposition of the techniques of literature that have been perfected in the 20th century, stream of consciousness, so forth and so on, slice of life. Finnegan's Wake was designed to be the night book to that day book. So it was conceived of as a dream, and one of the questions that undergraduates are asked to shed ink over is, whose dream is it? And what is this book about? I mean, when you first pick it up, it's absolutely daunting. There doesn't seem to be a way into it. It seems to be barely in English. And the notion, that one could, by spending time with this, tease out characters, plot, literary tension, resolution, this sort of thing, seems fairly unlikely. Actually, it's one of the few things that really repays pouring effort into it. The first 25 pages are incredibly dense, and most people are eliminated somewhere in those first 25 pages, and so you never really, it's a language, and you have to gain a facility with it, and you have to cheat. That's the other thing. And there's lots of help cheating because it has spawned a great exegetical literature, all kinds of pale scholars eager to give you the Celtic word lists of Finnegan's Wake, or a discussion of the doctrine of the transubstantiation in Finnegan's Wake, or so forth and so on. Hundreds of these kinds of doctoral theses in comp lit have been ground out over the decades. The reason I'm interested in it, I suppose I should fess up, is because it's two things, clearly. Finnegan's Wake is psychedelic, and it is apocalyptic / eschatological. And what I mean by those phrases is, first of all, what I mean by psychedelic is there is no stable point of view. There is no character per se. You never know who is speaking. You have to read into each speech to discover, is this King Mark, Anna Livia Plurabelle, Humphrey Chimp de Near Wicker, Shem the penman, Sean? Who is it? And identities are not fixed. Those of you who have followed my rap over the years, I'm always raving about how psychedelics dissolve boundaries. Well, Finnegan's Wake is as if you had taken the entirety of the last 1,000 years of human history and dissolved all the boundaries. So Queen Mob becomes Mae West. All the personages of pop culture, politics, art, church history, Irish legend, Irish internecine politics are all swirling, changing, merging. Time is not linear. You will find yourself at a recent political rally, then return to the court of this or that Abyssinian emperor or pharaoh. It's like a trip. And the great technique, I was thinking about this as I was thinking about this lecture, the great technique of the 20th century is collage or pastiche. It was originally developed by the Dadaists in Zurich in 1919. Right now it's having a huge resurgence in the form of sampling in pop music. And Joyce was the supreme sampler. I mean, he draws his material from technical catalogs, menus, legal briefs, treaty language, mythologies, dreams, doctor-patient conversations. Everything is grist for this enormous distillery. And yet, what comes out of this, once you learn the codes and once you learn to play the game, is a Joycean story that all graduates of Ulysses will recognize. I mean, what Joyce was about was an incredible sympathy with common people and an awareness of the dilemma of being a Jew in Irish Ireland, being a devotee of scholasticism in the 20th century, of dislocation and disorientation, of being the cuckolded husband, of being the failed divinity student. All of these characters and themes are familiar. It's quite an amazing accomplishment. There's nothing else like it in literature. It had very little anticipation. The only real anticipator of Joyce in English, I think, is Thomas Nash, who most people have never heard of. Thomas Nash was a contemporary of Shakespeare and wrote a famous, I don't know what that means in such a context, but a novel called it was called The Wayfaring Traveler. Anyway, Nash had this megalomanic richness of language, this attitude that it's better to put it in than take it out. And that's certainly what you get with Joyce. I mean, Joyce is so dense with technical terms, brand names, pop references, localisms. The way to conceive of Finnegan's Wake really is like a midden, a garbage dump. And there is, in fact, a garbage dump in the wake that figures very prominently. And what you, as the reader, have to do is go in there with nut pick and toothbrush and essentially remove one level after another level after another level and sink down and down. And the theme is always the same, you know, the delivery of the word, the misinterpretation of the word, and the redemption of the word at every level in all times and places. The reason I now gone some distance toward explaining why I think of it as psychedelic, the reason why I think of it as eschatological and apocalyptic is because he really, you know, it's hard to tell. We don't have James Joyce around to ask how much of this material he took seriously and how much of it was grist for his literary mill. But he was perfectly conversant with Renaissance theories of magic. The entire book is based on La Scienza Nuova of Giambattista Vico, who was I don't know what you would call him, a Renaissance sociologist, basically, and systems theorist. And Joyce once in a famous interview said that if the whole universe were to be destroyed and only Finnegan's Wake survive, that the goal had been that then the entire universe could be reconstructed out of this. Some of you who are students of Torah, this is a very Talmudic idea that somehow a book is the primary reality. You know, the idea in Hasidism in some schools is that all of the future is already contained in the Torah, and then when you ask them, well, if it's contained there, then isn't it predestined? And the answer is no, because the letters are scrambled, and only the movement of the present moment through the text correctly unscrambles and arranges the letter. This is Joyce thinking, for sure. And it's very close to a central theme in Joyce, and a central theme in the Western religious tradition, which is the coming into being, the manifestation of the Word, the declension of the Word into matter. And in a sense, what Joyce was trying to do was, he was in that great tradition of literary alchemy whose earlier practitioners were people like Robert Flood, Athanasius Kircher, Paracelsus. These are not familiar names, but in the late flowering of alchemy, when the birth of modern science the rosy glow could already be seen, the alchemists turned toward literary allegory in the 16th and early 17th century. Joyce is essentially in that tradition. I mean, this is an effort to condense the entire of experience, all as Joyce says in The Wake, all space-time in a nutshell is what we're searching for here. A kind of philosopher's stone of literary associations from which the entire universe can be made to blossom forth. And the way it's done is through pun and tricks of language and double and triple and quadruple entendre. No word is opaque. Every word is transparent, and you see through it to older meanings, stranger associations. And as your mind tries to follow these associative trees of connection, you eventually you get the feeling, which is the unique feeling that the wake gives you, which is, it's about as close to LSD on the page as you can get, because you are simultaneously many points of view, simultaneously many dramatis loci, many places in the plot, and the whole thing is riddled with resonance. You know, a man doing a task on one level is on another level a Greek god completing a task, and on another level some other figure of some more obscure mythology. So really, one thing about Finnegan's Wake, it's like a dipstick for your own intelligence. What you bring to it is going to determine what you get out. And if you have read the books which Joyce was familiar with, or if you have armed yourself with such simple things as a Fodor's Guide to Ireland, or a good map of Ireland, or a good work of Irish mythology, then it immediately begins to betray its secrets to you. And it's so rich that it's easy to make original discoveries. It's easy to see and understand things which probably have not been seen or understood since James Joyce put it there, because he had this kind of all-inclusive intelligence. Maybe I didn't make clear enough why that, to my mind, is an eschatological phenomena, this production of the Philosopher's Stone. It's because it's about the union of spirit and matter. That's what the Philosopher's Stone is about. And writing a book which aspires to be the seed for a living world is about the union of spirit and matter as well. And the Christian scenario of redemption at the end of profane history is another scenario of transubstantial union of spirit and matter. This seems to be, in fact, the overarching theme of Finnegan's Wake and of the 20th century. In terms of the temporal context for this book, it was finished in 1939, a few months before 1939, and Joyce died early in 1939. In a sense, he died in one of the most science fiction moments of the 20th century, because the Third Reich was going strong. It had not yet been pegged down a notch. Schemes of eugenics and 1,000-year racially purified super civilizations, all of that crazy early 40s stuff was happening. And the book is surprisingly modern. Television appears, psychedelic drugs appear, all of these things appear. I mean, presciently, he was some kind of a prophet. And also, he understood the 20th century sufficiently that the part he hadn't yet lived through was as transparent to him as the part that he had. He could see what was coming. Well, that's by way of my introduction. I want to read you what some other people have said about this, because I don't think I can say enough on my own. This is the indispensable book if you're serious about this, a skeleton key to Finnegan's Wake. And it takes the view that we don't know what this thing is, so we have to go through it literally, line by line. And he tells you the story, and the entire story, in the 1-page version, in the 10-page version, and in the 200-page version. And even in the 200-page version, there are sections where Campbell simply reports, The next 5 pages are extremely obscure. Mark it. But this is just a short section, and one of the things about working with the wake is you become, at first, this language, which is so impenetrable and bizarre, it ends up infecting you, and you become unable to write or talk any other way. So I'll read you some of Campbell's introduction, and I think you will see it's like the wake itself, except in baby steps. Introduction to a strange subject. Running riddle and fluid answer, Finnegan's Wake is a mighty allegory of the fall and resurrection of mankind. It is a strange book, a compound of fable, symphony, and nightmare, a monstrous enigma beckoning imperiously from the shadowy pits of sleep. Its mechanics resemble those of a dream which has freed the author from the necessities of common logic and has enabled him to compress all periods of history, all phases of individual and racial development into a circular design of which every part is beginning, middle, and end. In a gigantic wheeling rebus, dim effigies rumble past, disappear into foggy horizons, and are replaced by other images, vague but half-consciously familiar. On this revolving stage, mythological heroes and events of remotest antiquity occupy the same spatial and temporal planes as modern personages and contemporary happenings. All time occurs simultaneously. Tristram and Wellington, Father Adam and Humpty Dumpty merge in a single precept. Multiple meanings are present in every line. Interlocking allusions to keywords and phrases are woven like fugal themes into the pattern of the work. Finnegan's Wake is a prodigious, multifaceted monolith, not only the cauchemar of a Dublin citizen, but the dreamlike saga of guilt-stained, evolving humanity. The vast scope and intricate structure of Finnegan's Wake give the book a forbidding aspect of impenetrability. It appears to be a dense and baffling jungle, trackless and overgrown with wanton perversities of form and language. Clearly, such a book is not meant to be idly fingered. It tasks the imagination, exacts discipline and tenacity from those who would march with it. Yet some of the difficulties disappear as soon as the well-disposed reader picks up a few compass clues and gets his bearings. Then the enormous map of Finnegan's Wake begins slowly to unfold. Characters and motifs emerge, themes become recognizable, and Joyce's vocabulary falls more and more familiarly on the accustomed ear. Complete understanding is not to be snatched at greedily in one sitting, or in 50, I might add. Nevertheless, the ultimate state of the intelligent reader is certainly not bewilderment. Rather, it is an admiration for the unifying insight, economy of means, and more than Rabelaisian humor which have miraculously quickened the stupendous mass of material. One acknowledges at last that James Joyce's overwhelming micro-macrocosm could not have been fired to life in any sorcerer furnace less black, less heavy, less murky than this, his incredible book. He had to smelt the modern dictionary back to protean plasma and reenact the genesis and mutation of language in order to deliver his message. But the final wonder is that such a message could be delivered at all. Every book has to be about something. I mean, so what is this book about? Well, as far as anybody can tell, it appears to be about someone named, well, they have hundreds of names, actually, but for economy's sake, someone named Humphrey Chimpton Earwicker, or abbreviated HCE. And Humphrey Earwicker runs a pub in Chapelizod, which is a suburb or a district of London. And he has, as it says, an idyll wifey, who is Anna Livia Plurabelle. And now these two people, this barkeep and his wife, and their two children, Jerry and Kevin, or Shem and Sean, and then they also have hundreds of names because they occur on hundreds and hundreds of levels. Every brother struggle in history is enacted by the two boys, Jerry and Kevin. They are Shem the penman and Sean the other one. And they dichotomize certain parts of the process. So here is, in one paragraph, this is the Cliff Notes version of what Finnegan's Wake is all about. If you commit this to memory, you will never be caught wanting at a New York cocktail party. As the tale unfolds, we discover that Humphrey Chimpton Earwicker is a citizen of Dublin, a stuttering tavern keeper with a bull-like hump on the back of his neck. He emerges as a well-defined and sympathetic character, the sorely harrowed victim of a relentless fate, which is stronger than, yet identical with, himself. Joyce refers to him under various names, such as Here Comes Everybody and Haveth Childers Everywhere, indications of his universality and his role as the great progenitor. The hero has wandered vastly, leaving families, that is, deposits of civilization, at every pause along the way from Troy in Asia Minor. He is frequently called the Turk, up through the turbulent lands of the Goths, the Franks, the Norsemen, and overseas to the green isles of Britain and Eire. His chief Germanic manifestations are Woden and Thor, his chief Celtic, Manannan MacLair. Again, he is St. Patrick carrying the new faith. Again, Strongbow leading the Anglo-Norman conquest. Again, Cromwell conquering with a bloody hand. Most specifically, he is our Anglican tavern keeper, HCE, in the Dublin suburb Chapelizod. So, like Ulysses, the ground zero here is the utterly mundane, middle-class, tormented Irish people embedded in the detritus of the 20th century. But there's an effort to never lose the cosmic perspective, never lose the sense that we are, not individuals lost in time, but the front ends of gene streams that reach back to Africa, that we somehow have all these ancestors and conflicts swarming and storming within it. It's a glorious, psychedelic, heartful Irish view of what it is to be embedded in the mystery of existence. Well, okay, enough arm waving. Now let's cut the cake here. River run past Eve and Adams, from swerve of shore to bend of bay, brings us by a commodious vicus of recirculation back to Howth Castle and environs. Sir Tristram, the Lord of Moors fra o'er the short sea, had passing corps re-arrived from North Amorica, on this side the scraggy isthmus of Europe Minor, to welter fight his peninsulate war, nor had Top Sawyer's rocks by the stream Oconee exaggerated themselves to Lawrence County Gorgios, while they went Dublin their mumber all the time, nor a voice from a fire bellowed Misha, Misha to Tart Toff, thou'rt Patrick. Not yet, though Venice soon after had a kid-scad butt-ended a bland old Isaac. Not yet, though all's fair in Vanity, were Sophie Fester's wroth with 2-in-1 Nathan Joe. Rot a peck of Paw's malt had gem or shen brewed by arc light, and Rory end to the Regenbow was to be seen ringsome on the aqua face. The fall, Baba Baba Dalgara Hagatak Amina Arong Kwarak Brontong Nerung Kwabang Varahu Tingat Aktul Hur Dimon Wangamanunuk. Of a once Wall Street old par is retailed early in bed and later on life down through all Christian minstrelsy. The great fall of off-wall entailed at such short notice the fit shoot of Finnegan, erse solid man, that the Humpty Hill head of himself promptly sends an unquiring one well to the west in quest of his tumpty-tum-toes, and their up-turnpike toe and place is at the knockout in the park, where oranges have been laid to rust upon the green since Devlin's first loved Livy. So, now, granted that the first pages are dense, and it isn't all this dense, because even though the concept of fractals lay years in the future, the effort here is to tell the whole damn thing in the first word, to tell it again in the next 2 words, to tell it again in the next 3 words, and so on. So here in these first roughly 3 paragraphs, a huge amount of information is being passed along. First of all, we're given a location if we're smart enough to know it. River Run, past Even Adams, from swerve of shore to bend of bay, brings us by a commodious vicus of recirculation back to Haworth Castle and environs. Well, now, if you know the geography of Dublin, you know that's where you are, because, and notice Haworth Castle and environs is HCE. These initials recur thousands of times in this book, always bringing you back to remind you that this has something to do with Humphrey Earwicker. What this first sentence says is, River Run, and it's the River Liffey, which we will meet in 1,000 reincarnations, because Anna Livia Plurabelle is the personification of the goddess River. The river runs past Even Adams, and there is a church there on the shore named Adam and Eve's in Dublin, from swerve of shore to bend of bay, and then this strange phrase brings us by a commodious vicus of recirculation. This announces the great architectonic plan of the wake, that it is in fact going to be based on the sociological ruminations of Giambattista Vico's La Scienza Nuova, the vicus mode of recirculation, because, as I'm sure you all know, Vico's theory of the fall and redemption of mankind was that there were 4 ages. I can't remember, gold, silver, iron, and clay, I think. And so this idea of the recirculation, of the connectedness, of the cyclicity, of the, as he says, the same again and again. Finnegan, sin again, the same again. And this is one of his great, great themes, is the recurso. Everything comes again. Nothing is unannounced. Love affair, every dynastic intrigue, every minor political disgrace, and a minor political disgrace figures very prominently in this book, because as the carrier of Adam's sin, the great dilemma for Humphrey Earwicker is that he is running for a minor political post, alderman. But apparently one night, rather juiced, he relieved himself. Well, there are many versions, and you hear them all, and they are all given in dreams and in mock trials and in accusatory fantasy. He either innocently took a leak in the park, or he fondled himself in some way in the presence of Maggie and her sister in such a way that his reputation is now at great risk. And it all depends on the testimony of a cad, a soldier, or perhaps 3 soldiers. It's never clear. It's constantly shifting. And this question of, what happened when Maggie seen all with her sister in shawl at the magazine wall haunts the book, because on it turns the question of whether HCE is a stalwart pillar of the community, or in fact a backsliding masturbator and a monster, and so forth and so on, as one always is if one is trapped in a James Joyce novel. Then this puzzling list in the second paragraph is simply a list of things which haven't happened yet. Sir Tristram, lover of music, violor d'amours, for o'er the short sea, had passing corps, not yet, re-arrived from North Amorica, from the coast of Brittany, on this side the scraggy isthmus of Europe Minor, to welterweight his peninsulate war. Now, this word peninsulate is typical Joyce punning. Peninsulate war, obviously, because it's being launched from Brittany. Peninsulate war, because Sir Tristram is the great archetype of the lover, and so his war is peninsulate. Okay, so that's the first thing that has not yet happened, it's telling you. Sir Tristram has not yet come to Ireland, to put it simply. Nor has Top Sawyer's rocks by the stream Oconee exaggerated themselves to Lawrence County gorgios while they went doubling their mumber all the time. Now, this is further obscurity. There is a stream in Georgia, and Top Sawyer is a reference to Tom Sawyer, because Tom Sawyer was Huck Finn's friend, and Huck Finn is Finn in America. There is a huge amount of Mark Twain that has been poured into these books because of the Huckleberry Finn connection, Finn in the New World. And Top Sawyer's rocks is a reference possibly to testicles and so forth and so on. Every single word, I mean, you can just take a word and go into this and until you exhaust yourself. And then the next thing that has not yet happened. Nor a voice from a fire bellowed, Misha, Misha, to Tartuffe, thou art Petric. Tartuffe is Celtic for thou art baptized. So St. Patrick has not yet baptized in Ireland. Not yet, though venison after. And the venison is a pun on venison and very soon. Had a kid-scad butt-ended a bland old Isaac. It's a reference to the Isaac Esau tale in the Bible. It's also a reference to Isaac Butts, who was a figure in the politics of the Irish Rebellion. Not yet, those all's fairs in Vanity, were Sophie Sesters wrought with to a Nathan Joe. That's, at this point, a very obscure reference, but there is a great incest and sister theme in Finnegan's Wake. And the mistresses of Jonathan Swift become carriers of a huge amount of energy in here, as do the mistresses of Thomas Sterne, because it's better to be Swift than Sterne, or something like that. And then the last of these things which hadn't happened yet. Rot a peck of Paul's malt had gem or shem brewed by arclight, and Rory into the Regenbrow was to be seen ringsome on the aqua face. That seems pretty obscure to me. According to Joseph Campbell, it's simply a reference to the presence of God moving over the waters in the first lines of Genesis. Ringsome on the aqua face. Then this phrase, the fall, and the multisyllabic word, with that word, these are the Viconian thunders, and they announce the beginning of each Viconian age. And when the thunder speaks, you know then that you're into a transition. Then it actually launches in the last paragraph into a fairly straightforward evocation of at least the mythological Finnegan. As you all probably know, there is an Irish drinking ballad of great antiquity called the Ballad of Tim Finnegan, or the Ballad of Finnegan's Wake. And it tells the story of Tim Finnegan, who was a hod carrier, a bricklayer's assistant, and he was given to hitting the poteen rather hard, and he fell from his ladder. It's the Humpty Dumpty story. He fell from his ladder and he broke his back, and his friends waked him in the grand Irish fashion, and at the height of the wake they became so carried away and intoxicated that they upended a bucket of Guinness over his head, and he revived and joined the dance.
Tim Finnegan lived in Walking Street, a gentle Irishman, mighty odd. He'd a beautiful brogue, so rich and sweet. To rise in the world he carried a hat. You see the sort of a tippling way, with a love for the liquor poor Tim was born. To help a man with his work each day, to draw with a crater every morn. Whack for the dan, oh dance to your partner, well to blow your trotters shake. Wasn't it the truth I told you? Lots of fun at Finnegan's Wake. One morning Tim got rather full, his head felt heavy which made him shake. Fell from a ladder and he broke his skull, and they carried him home his corpse to wake. Roll him up in a nice clean sheet and laid him out upon the bed. A gallon of whiskey at his feet and a bottle of porker at his head. Whack for the dan, oh dance to your partner, well to blow your trotters shake. Wasn't it the truth I told you? Lots of fun at Finnegan's Wake. His friends assembled at the wake, and Mrs. Finnegan called for lunch. First she brought in tea and cake, then pipes, tobacco and whiskey punch. And the O'Brien began to cry, such a nice clean corpse did you ever see? Tim of Orlean, why did you die? A howl your gob, said Paddy McGee. Whack for the dan, oh dance to your partner, well to blow your trotters shake. Wasn't it the truth I told you? Lots of fun at Finnegan's Wake. Then Maggie O'Connor took up the job, a Biddy she you're wrong I'm sure. Biddy gave her a belt and the gop and left her sprawling on the floor. Then the war did soon engage, woman to woman and man to man. Shillelagh law was all the rage, and a row and a ruction soon began. Whack for the dan, oh dance to your partner, well to blow your trotters shake. Wasn't it the truth I told you? Lots of fun at Finnegan's Wake. Then Mickey Maloney raised his head when a noggin of whiskey flew at him. It missed him falling on the bed, the liquor scattered over Tim. Tim revived, see how he rises, Timothy rising from the bed, said, well, your whiskey around like blazes, Tanham and Dale, do you think I'm dead? Whack for the dan, oh dance to your partner, well to blow your trotters shake. Wasn't it the truth I told you? Lots of fun at Finnegan's Wake.
This is the resurrection. I mean, Tim Finnegan is very clearly for Joyce a Christ figure. And here is then the first evocation of Tim Finnegan, the fall, then the Viconian thunder, of a once Wall Street old par, which is just an old person, is retailed early in bed and later on life down through all Christian minstrelsy. The great fall of the off-wall entailed at such short notice the shoot of Finnegan. Now this word, P-F-T-J-S-C-H-U-T-E, fitshoot, is Norwegian, I'm informed, and refers it refers to the act of falling, and the act of falling from a hill. Finnegan, earth's solid man, that the Humpty Hill head of himself promptly sends an unquiring one well to the west in quest of his tumpty-tum-toes, and their upturned pike point and place is at the knockout in the park, where oranges have been laid to rust upon the green since Devlin's first loved Livy. This is fairly transparent if you're Irish or a citizen of Dublin, because what it's talking about is Dublin is imagined to be situated basically in the belly of an enormous giant person who is Finnegan. Finnegan lies like a giant reclining figure along the Liffey there, husband and wife, river and mountain. And this is actually then, the focus has changed, and now we're talking about the geography. He was a solid man, Earth's solid man, but then somehow he turned into something where the Humpty Hill head of himself promptly sends an unquiring one well to the west in quest of his Tumpty Tumtoes. And if you have a map of Dublin laid out, you can actually see this enormous man in the landscape. And there are many enormous men and women in the landscape of this planet. And Joyce maps the Dublin geography over all of them. Some of you may know Iztaccíhuatl, the magical mountain in Mexico. Iztaccíhuatl means the sleeping woman in Toltec. And many mountains are imagined to be sleeping people. So here he introduces this theme, and this is one paragraph. This is the invocation of Finnegan as hod carrier. Big Mr. Finnegan of the stuttering hand, freeman's mower, lived in the broadest way imaginable in his rush lit too far back for messages before Joshua and Judges had given us numbers or Helveticus commuted Deuteronomy. One yeasty day he sternly strucks his teeth in a tub for to wash the future of his fates. But ere he swiftly took it out again, by the might of Moses, the very water was evaporated, and all the gunnesses had met their exodus. So that ought to show you what a pension junchy chap he was. And during mighty odd years, this man of hod cement and edifices, HCE, hod cement and edifices, in Toppersthorpe piled Bildung supra Bildung pon the banks of the livers by the so-and-so. He iade idle fifi Annie, ogged the little creature, with her hair in huns took up your part in her, off while babulous, mirror ahead with goodly trowel in grasp and ivory-old overalls which he had particularly fancied. Like Harum Childeric Egerbirth, he would calculate by multiplicables the altitude and multitude until he seesaw by neat light of the liquor where twint was born his round head stable of other days to rise in undress masonry upstanded joy granite, a wallworth of a skier scrape of most Eiffel howeth and towerly, originating from next to nothing, and skating the hymnals and all, higher architect typoflopical, with a burning bush a bob off its bubble top, and with Lawrence O'Tooler's clittering up and Thomas a Bucket's clattering down. Now, what this paragraph says is he was a great builder. And I think if you think back through your impression of hearing it read, you knew that. You know, these words that are associated, words like a wall worth of a skyer scrape of most Eiffel howeth and towerly. These are skyscraper words. Woolworth, skyscrape, in towerly, howeth, so forth and so on. And he can do this. He can build up a pastiche of surfaces, of impressions. Now, you might say, why is there no economy? Well, there is no economy because economy is an aesthetic criterion for shoemakers, not for artists. And, economy is the curse of the Bauhaus babblers from hell, which Joyce was very concerned to refute all of that. If you have to place this in a context, it's in the context of the most hallucinatory of the Baroque This is Arcamboldo land. This is a work that would have been welcome at the Rudolphine court in Prague. It's a work of magical complexity and enfolded self-reference. Now, we've just been through these first 4 paragraphs. Now I'll read you what Joseph Campbell has to say on it. By no means all of what he has to say on it. The first 4 paragraphs are the suspended tick of time between a cycle just past and one about to begin. They are, in effect, an overture, resonant with all the themes of Finnegan's Wake. The dominant motif is the polylingual thunderclap of paragraph 3, Baba Baba Darlier Woman, that one, which the voice of God makes audible through the noise of Finnegan's fall. Narrative movement begins with the life, fall, and wake of hod-carrier Finnegan, pages 4 to 7. The wake scene fades into the landscape of Dublin and environs. We've just heard how he fell from the ladder. Now we move into a description of the wake, and there's a certain voice that appears at certain times. It's where there are a lot of words ending in A-T-I-O-N, continuation of the celebration until the examination of the extermination. These are the 12 judges. Each character, when they appear, has a certain tempo to their character. So when that tempo enters the text, you know the character is present, even though there may be no trace. For example, Anna Livia Pluribel's tempo is the tempo of the hen. Here a little, there a little, go a little, see a little, do a little. The hen is scratching. This is this nervous, bird-like. That's Anna Livia's signature. Here's just one paragraph from the wake scene, which builds and has quite a minor amount of humor associated with it. I should say. Macul or whya did ye day of a trying Thursday morning, sobs they sided at Finnegan's chrysamorous wake, all the hooligans of the nation prostrated in their consternation, and their do dismally proflusive plethora of ululation. There was plums and groons and cherifs and citherers and raiders and cinnamon too, and they all joined in with the shoutmost joviality, Agog and Magog, and the round of them agrog, to the continuation of that celebration until Hand and Hungan's extermination. Some in Kinkin chorus, more can Keenan, belling him up and filling him down. He's stiff, but he's steady as Priamolum. 'Twas he was a decent, gay, labouring youth, sharpen his pillow scone, tap up his beer. Where in this whirl will ye hear such a din again, with their deep brow fundigs and the dusty fidelios? They laid him brawn drawn a lang last bed, with a buckalips of fisky for his feet and a barrel load of Guinness o'er his head. To the total of the fluid hang the twaddle of the fuddle dough. Well, it's a drunken Irish wake. That seems clear. But there are a lot of things going on. Where in this whirl will you hear such a din again? And he's stiff, but he's steady as Priamolam. All this Dionysian and sexual imagery is fully explicit. In some ways more realized as a character, or more lovable, if that's the word, is Anna Livia Pluribel. I mean, Anna Livia Pluribel is Molly Bloom on acid, basically. I mean, Molly Bloom, we don't lose her outlines. We understand Molly, and because Molly doesn't offer us that much of her own mind. She stands for the eternal feminine, but only in the final soliloquy in Ulysses do we really contact her. Anna Livia, it's her book. It may in fact be her dream, and the whole thing is permeated with her tensions and her cares. As it says, Grandpapas is fallen down, meaning the great Father God is at wake. Grandpapas is fallen down, but Grinny spreads the board, meaning Anna Livia is always there. She's always there. And in the wake, really you could almost say that Molly Bloom's soliloquy has been expanded to 300, 400 pages. And the whole thing is a meditation on the river. The river is the feminine, and the first image in the book and the last image are the image of the river. The river dissolves everything and carries it out to sea. Let me read this description of Anna Livia Plurabelle, and then we'll go back to the synopsis. How beautiful and how true to wife of her, when strangely forbidden to steal our historic presence from the past post-propophoticals, so as to will make us all lordy heirs and lady maidennesses of a pretty nice kettle of fruit. She is living in our midst of debt and laughing through all plores for us. Her birth is uncontrollable, with a naparon for her mask and her sabots kicking arias, so ser, so solly. If yous ask me and I sack you, how, Greeks may rise and Troisers fall, she is mercenary. Through the length of the land lies under liquidation, flut, and there's nar a harbow nor an eyebrush on this glabrous place of herschrift. What our Walter shall loan a vesta and hire some peat and sarch the shores her cockles to heat, and she'll do all a tarf woman can to puff the business on, puff, to puff the blaziness on, puff, puff, and even if Humphrey shall fall frumpty times as awkward again in the beard's busaloom of all our grand remonstrances, there'll be eggs for the breakers come to mourn him, sunny side up with care. So true it is that there's where's a turnover, the tay is wet too, and when you think you catch sight of a hind, make sure you're cocked by a hen. Well, Nora felt that Jimmy would have been much better as a singer. She so stated that she had great hopes for his voice, and she was a very practical woman, Nora Barnacle. There wasn't a literary bone in her body, I think. I think that's what Joyce loved about her, was that she was the real thing. And all these women, Molly and Olivia, they all are Nora Joyce for sure. He died shortly after it was published, although it had been known in manuscript for over 10 years to the literati of his circle. It was called Work in Progress. And people didn't even know if he was serious or not. And it was very hard to find a publisher. It was a typographical nightmare. Joyce was going blind. And so, trying to keep track of the spelling, and there's hardly a standard spelling in there. There's hardly a word that is not somehow fiddled with and changed around. If you pay attention to what you're calling life as it is, you will discover that it's not a simple thing at all. That it's that it's like this. I mean, I used to say, when you're vacuuming your apartment, Rome falls 9 times an hour. And your job is to notice. And you always do notice, but you never tell yourself that you're noticing. So in the course of a day, I live, and you live, to some degree, the entirety of global civilization. I mean, Rome falls, algebra is discovered, the Turks are beating at the gates of Vienna, and it isn't even 11 a.m. yet, So there is this sense of the co-presence of history. we are imprisoned inside the linear assumption that I'm a person in a place, in a time, I'm alive, most people aren't. But in fact, when you deconstruct all that, that is fiction. And the truth is more this onrushing magma of literary association, and in Ulysses you get an enormous amount of half-baked science. Leopold Bloom is always looking at things and explaining to himself how they work using very crackpotted notions of hydraulics and electricity and this sort of thing. I think people say the psychedelic experience is hard to remember, dreams are hard to remember, but harder to remember than either of those is simply ordinary experience. You lie in the bath and you close your eyes for 30 seconds and empires fall, dynastic families unfold themselves, power changes hands, princes are beheaded, a pope disgraced, so forth. That was for you. And and then somebody drops something and you wake up and 15 seconds have passed. That's the reality of life, but we suppress this chaotic, irrational side. The genius of Joyce and to some degree, although in a more controlled form, Proust, and then there were other practitioners, Faulkner certainly, was what they called stream of consciousness. But what it was an ability to listen to the associating mind without trimming, pruning, judging, denying. One of the great puzzles to me is the great antagonism between Jung and Joyce, because you would have thought that they would have been comrades in arms, but Joyce loathed psychoanalysis. He thought that to use all this material to elucidate imagined pathologies was a very uncreative use of it, and that it should all be fabricated into literature. It's very hard to surpass. Thomas Pynchon, William Gaddis, these people, everybody genuflects to Joyce, but very few people plow in the way he did. I mean, Thomas Pynchon is considered a difficult, hallucinatory writer, and there isn't 20 pages in Gravity's Rainbow as obscure as a randomly chosen page here. I can understand the impulse to want to get the universe into a book, because it hints at something that we've talked about in some of these circles, or whatever they are, which is that the character of life is like a work of literature. We are told that you're supposed to fit your experience into the model which science gives you, which is probabilistic, statistical, predictable, and yet it's the felt datum of experience is much more literary than that. I mean, we fall in love, we make and lose fortunes, we inherit houses in Scotland, we lose everything, we get terrible diseases, we're cured of them, or we die of them. But it all has this Strom und Drang aspect to it, which physics is not supposed to have, but which literature always has. And I think that, I don't know if it's true, but I think what Joyce believed, and what I'm willing to entertain at some depth, is the idea that salvation is somehow an act of encompassing comprehension. That salvation is an actual act of apprehension, of understanding, and that this act of apprehension involves everything. This is why the the alchemic, before James Joyce and this kind of literature, the only place where you got these kinds of constructs was in alchemy and magic. The idea that, through an act of magic, the universe could be condensed to yield a fractal microcosm of itself. Well, then what Joyce is saying is that the novel, which was unknown in the alchemical era, the novel comes later, arguably, but the real zest for the novel comes in the 19th century, that the novel is the alchemical retort into which these theories of how things work can be cast. I think the great modern exponent of this, although now dead, and certainly one who owed an enormous debt to Joyce, was Vladimir Nabokov, especially in Ada. Ada is his paean of praise to Finnegan's Wake, basically, and the idea tacked in there is the idea of causality and ordinary casuistry. See, what all these people are saying, I think, and what the psychedelic experience argues for as well, is that we are somehow prisoners of language, and that somehow, if we're prisoners of language, then the key which will set us loose is somehow also made of language. What else could fit the lock? So somehow an act of poetic legerdemain is necessary. And Joyce, in Finnegan's Wake, he didn't live to argue the case or to work it out. He died shortly after. But this comes about as close as anybody ever came to actually pushing the entire contents of the universe down into about 14 cubic inches. Joyce and Proust had one meeting, and supposedly Joyce said to Proust, "I'm too young for you to teach me anything." Are you all familiar with the Remembrance of Things Past? Well, it could hardly be a more different work of literature. It is stately and cinematic, and you always know where you are, and the characters are defined. It's an old-style novel, but there are places in it where he just takes flight and prefigures the kind of writing that Faulkner and Joyce were able to do. As far as psychedelic influences, I don't know that there are arguably any. Joyce lived in Trieste for a while and taught English. He may have been, as a habitué of Paris, he may have been familiar with hashish. He probably had some familiarity with absinthe, but I doubt that it was a lifestyle for him. I think that the whole of the 20th century is informed by this hyperdimensional understanding, and that, Jung tapping into it in the 20s, the Dadaists in 1919 in Zurich, the Surrealists, even earlier, the École de Pataphysique, L'Entremont, Jarry, all of these people. It's what it's about, the 20th century, is this, the McLuhan's phrase comes to mind, the Gutenberg galaxy, the spectrum of effects created by print. The classes, the conceits, the industries, the products, the attitudes, the garments, all of the things created by print. And we are living in a terminal civilization. I don't want to say dying, because civilizations aren't animals, but we are living in an age of great self-summation, when what we look back at is basically since the fall of Rome, there has been an unbroken working out of certain themes. Scholasticism, the Aristotelian and Platonic corpuses, Christianity, always presented as somehow a rival to science, is in fact paves the way for science. There would have been no science had there not been William of Ockham, who was a 14th century nominalist theologian. Really, Western civilization has had 1,000 years to work its magic, and now there is a summation underway, and I don't certainly presume, at least not this evening, to judge it. How do you place a value on an entire civilization? But in the same way that when a person dies, their entire life passes before them in review. When a civilization dies, it hypnagogically cycles the detritus of centuries and centuries of struggle to understand. And someone like Joyce, I think, just brings that to an excruciating climax, because it's all there, you know. It's all there, from the smile that tugs at the lips of the woman in the Arnolfini wedding, to quantum physics, to what Molière said to his niece in the 15th letter, and so forth and so on. And the task is to hold it in your mind. I think it was William James who said, if we don't read the books with which we carefully line our apartments, then we're no better than our dogs and cats. And, too often this is lost sight of. And the point of it, it's not simply that we are aesthetes, littérateurs, and that here in the twilight of the gods we should sit around reading James Joyce. That isn't the point. The point is that this is the distillation of our experience of what it is to be human, and it's out of these kinds of distilling processes that we can launch some kind of new dispensation for the human enterprise, because we have played it out. It's now a set piece, all of it. I mean, when I listen to rock and roll now, it's interesting to me, but it has the completedness of polyphony. You know, it's a done deal somehow. And we're looking backward, and we're anticipating. And the purpose of literature, I think, is to illuminate the past and to give a certain guidance as we move into the future. And this book, by being at first so opaque and so challenging to aesthetic canons and social values, eventually emerges as a very prescient insight into our circumstance. The Ballad of Finnegan's Wake has hundreds of verses, and in an Irish pub it can keep people going all night long. It's a celebration of complexity and of the human journey, and Joyce doesn't judge. I mean, you know, it says somewhere in Finnegan's Wake, here in Moycane, which is the red light district of Dublin, here in Moycane we flop on the seamy side. But up Nient, prospector, you sprout all your worth and woof your wings. So if you want to be phoenixed, come and be parked. That's that passage about death. Here in Moycane we flop on the seamy side. But up Nient, you sprout all your worth and woof your wings. It was a very optimistic, transformative sort of vision. somehow complexity is the ocean we have to learn to surf.
The river.
Yes, that's the river. And that's the psychedelic side of it. I mean, imagine that you can get 63,000 different words in here, tell a story, and have all the common articles and modifiers operating normally anyway. And then it's very optimistic. I mean, Molly Bloom's speech is, probably the single most optimistic outpouring in all of 20th century literature. Not that there was much competition, but yes, the final affirmation, yes. Sam Beckett, Nobel Prize winner, genius in his own right, but secretary to James Joyce for many, many years, and passionately in love with Joyce's tragically schizophrenic daughter. One of the, you want an unhappy story, the story of Sam. You'll find out why Sam Beckett is not exactly laughing all the time in his work. A very, very complex relationship to Joyce's schizophrenic child. Joyce's family life was not very happy. I think he had a wonderfully sensuous life with Nora. But I don't know what it would be like to be the guy who wrote this book and live with a woman who thought you would be better off as a saloon singer. Not exactly a saloon singer. I mean, he did, but still. Shall I try and find a passage? Let us now, whether health, dangers, public orders, and other circumstances permitting, of perfectly convenient, if you police, after you, police, pardoning mine, ich bin so freisch bei, drop this jitter-pokery and talk straight turkey, mate to mate. For while the ear, be we milk-alls or Nicholists, may sometimes be inclined to believe others, the eye, whether browned or Nolanst, finds it devilish hard now and again even to believe itself. Habeus aures et nun vidibis, habeus oculos ad hoc manus palipobatus. Tip, drawing nearer to take our slant at it, since after all it has met with misfortunes while all underground. Let us see all there may remain to be seen. But I am a worker, a tombstone mason, anxious to please Avery Buries, and Julie glad when Christmas comes his once a year. You are a poor Jewist, unctuous to police nopey bobbies, and tunny belly solely when 'tis thine took or home gin. We cannot say eye to eye, we cannot smile nose from nose. Still, one cannot help noticing that rather more than half of the lines run north-south in the Nemzis and Bucharest directions, while the others go west-east in search from Malazis via Bulgarad. For tiny tot, though it looks when Schwamphumpfsling, alongside other incunabula, it has its cardinal points for all of that. Tip. Now, this word tip, which keeps occurring throughout the text, no one is clear what it means, but Joe Campbell's guess is it's a tree branch which is tapping against the window, and whoever is dreaming this huge hallucinatory gizmo of a dream, every once in a while the tap of the branch breaks through.
Tell me what every face tell me. Everybody have a past. They have pain. And they have something they want.